Kong was rocked by another violent clash on Sunday, again between rowdy youth and police. Is such violence becoming the new normal for street protests there? Then we meet one of the biggest names in auto racing. What do his plans to soon start producing luxury cars in China say about the country's growing auto industry and car culture? I'm Cheung Siu in for Liu Xin today. Welcome to The Point. What happened in Hong Kong Sunday night is becoming a familiar but frightening scene. Youth confront police, protests turn violent, then physical injuries, property destruction, and more hand-wringing about how to solve the crisis. Just 5 days earlier, Hong Kong's chief executive Carrie Lam had pronounced a proposed but controversial fugitives bill dead. And while she defended the right of Hong Kong residents to protest publicly, she urged them to do so peacefully. Why weren't Lam's words enough to prevent Sunday's mayhem by those she now brands as rioters? And is this movement morphing into a broader challenge to China's one country, two systems policy over Hong Kong? Joining me from Xi'an via Skype is Wang Jiangyu, director of the Asian Law Institute at the National University of Singapore. From Hong Kong, Cheung Siu Wai, a senior lecturer at Hong Kong Baptist University. And here in our Beijing studio, Qinduo, a senior fellow with the Pangoal Institution think tank. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Now, before I get to my first question, let's briefly recap what happened on Sunday. And this is according to police sources. More than 20 protesters and police officers were injured in the violent clashes on Sunday. Police arrested 47 people there for offenses such as unlawful assembly, assaulting police officers, obstructing officers in possession of offensive weapons. A fresh graduate from the University of Hong Kong, who was aged 22, was charged with biting off a police officer's finger. Mr. Wang in Xi'an, help us make sense of the situation in Hong Kong now. What's your understanding of this latest wave of protests?
I think on the one hand, it shows that the protests have been escalated into violence and destruction, which is certainly inconsistent with the right to peaceful assembly, which is actually part of the universal human rights. And on the other hand, we can see that because some of the fundamental problems in Hong Kong haven't been addressed, and some protests have become radicals.
Okay. Mr. Cheung, in Hong Kong, in previous protests and demonstrations, the police reaction to protesters, to violent protesters, has been called into question and has even become a demand of protesters to look into, investigate police reactions to those demonstrations. What's your take on how the police acted or reacted to Sunday's demonstrations?
I think the reactions by the police on Sunday is still quite lenient because they did not use severe forces. The protesters used some of the things to strike and even beat the police, and the police had to fight back. I think this kind of struggle in Hong Kong are becoming a kind of commonplace. In the past, there were very few such incidents, like a police officer being beaten by a group of people. Usually, in many places in the world, you don't see this. But in Hong Kong, the police are not prepared for large, violent group of people who can beat the police. I think in some of the cases, you could see in violent protesters, whenever they come to such a point in other countries, the police would use even more severe forces. But in Hong Kong, we never saw anything like water cannon or something like that, or teaser guns, or some of the things that the European or American law enforcement officers would use.
Got it. Mr. Xu, leniency from the police didn't go very far where the protesters did it. Carrie Lam certainly has urged for calm and peaceful demonstrations. Are peaceful demonstrations no longer possible in Hong Kong?
Well, obviously, with the latest development, unavoidably, you are saddened to see what's happening in Hong Kong. The police force, they represent the law, they are part of the law enforcement, and I think in dealing with the police, you show your respect because that's the law. Unfortunately, that's not the case over the weekend. So, despite the concession from the government with the suspension of the fugitive bill, you would expect the protesters would also make some say concessions or compromise because their voice have been heard, their concern have been known. I think that's the purpose. But now, no, they didn't stop. They continue with protests and more violent protests. I think this is really an issue now about law and order.
Talking about concessions, one of the concessions the SAR government did was to shelve the controversial fugitives bill. They officially suspended the bill, with Carrie Lam even going so far as saying the bill is now dead. Mr. Chan in Hong Kong, if in the beginning the protests were about that bill, now that the bill has been shelved, why have the protests and demonstrations stopped?
I think the demonstrators have different demands, and they often say they have 5 major demands, and some of the contents have shifted. And now we see in the last several demonstrations or marches, we could see some of the protest march participants holding the banners which include true democracy, which means universal suffrage and other things which has been not been accepted by the central authorities in Beijing and the Hong Kong government. So that's something even larger than this bill. So the bill is dead. However, the larger issue remains. So some of the people in the protest would like to have more demands on different other things, including setting up a commissioner, a very independent commission to investigate the activities and so on. So these have been answered by the chief executive in her way to avoid any further confrontation or struggle. However, the demands have not been met, and some of the people will continue to do. I want to point out one more thing. There is a political overtone here as well. The political campaigns have been underway for the district election this year and the Legislative Council election next year. So some of the politicians are also involved in this. So it's more complicated than just a simple bill, or the bill is dead or not.
Mr. Wang, let's talk for a moment about the bill. There was some confusion when Carrie Lam used the word dead. Is that the same as what the protesters have been demanding, a formal withdrawal of the deal?
I think it's substantially the same. We have to take word at its face value. It basically means she wouldn't ask the legislature to consider and to adopt the bill again during her term of office. So the death of the bill, the withdrawal of the bill, and it means the same thing. So in that regard, we can fairly say that the protesters' demand has been fulfilled in this regard.
Mr. Xu, this is now more than just about that fugitives bill. If the protesters have more than just one claim here, it has spilled over to other areas where they feel angered with, where they are frustrated with. What will the SAR government consider in terms of quelling this crisis and dissolving this crisis?
I think it's very difficult just for the SAR government to make concessions after concessions. Look, they are basically, the demand for setting up a commission to do investigation about the so-called excessive use of force by the police. Then the SAR government rejected that demand. Basically, they are asking for amnesty, for that rioters who violated the law, who broke the law, and they're asking for forgiveness, asking for being above the law, basically, simply because we are fighting for freedom, so we are above the law. This is nonsense. I think the SAR government cannot give concessions after concessions simply because these protesters, they are acting like spoiled kids. They don't show any sense of responsibility and don't show any respect for law. And if they are mature enough, they should know, they should demonstrate the spirit of concession or compromise, and then they can peacefully push forward whatever they are demanding for. And for future, for a better future for Hong Kong and a better future for the young people in Hong Kong. So you have to work with the government. If you are seeking confrontation, if you are continue to fight the government, I'm not sure the government alone can solve all the problems.
A good chunk of the protesters are young people with a unique understanding of what's happening, what's been transforming in the Hong Kong society. Mr. Chan, how does the S-era government seek a conversation with these young people so that they will listen?
I think they need to have some real solid work with the demonstrators or protesters in different ways. One thing we see in the recent past, in the last several days, is a kind of slippery slope in the social order. This is something that the SAR government should do and must do, because as we know, some of the violence and some of the activities which is illegal under the law should be stopped. And if you do not stop this, petty crimes or violations, misdemeanors would evolve into a kind of major issue. And I remember many years ago when I was working in New York as a journalist, we see the New York City Police Commissioner Bratton and the Mayor Giuliani use this, the so-called broken window theory. They say if you do not stop these kind of activities, eventually it will get into even worse. So nowadays, we see law and order in Hong Kong has been broken, and the government doesn't show any resolve to solve these issues. I think the government should take seriously to make sure that law and order is existing here and continue to exist. And very recently, the business sector already voiced their concern about the situation in Hong Kong.
Okay.
So for the future of Hong Kong, you should do something to make people believe that Hong Kong remains calm.
Mr. Wang, it's no doubt that the social order has been severely disrupted by the violent and disruptive behavior of some of the protesters. Do you share the concerns of some of the people that the rule of law, which is the cornerstone of the Hong Kong society, has failed its people?
I do. I think the recent development with respect to law and order has been very disappointing. Hong Kong is a very cosmopolitan place, and it has always been regarded for many decades as one of the best places governed by the rule of law. And Hong Kong can attract business, attract tourism, and Hong Kong people like to come to Hong Kong to invest and do business because of its rule of law. And Hong Kong would be nothing without the rule of law. So the recent development shows that the very radical behavior some of the protesters actually make rule of law diminishing, and the rule of law has been undermined. And if Hong Kong does not have rule of law, which means the final decline of the city is inevitable.
Okay. We don't have a lot of time left, but I want to get very briefly from all three of you, starting with Mr. Xu here in Beijing. The protesters have announced plans to hold further demonstrations towards the end of this month. What will happen next, and what could be possible solutions on the part of the SAR government?
I would say street politics is not the key to solve Hong Kong's problem. I think it needs an open dialogue, a thorough debate with the government and the involvement of the residents in Hong Kong.
Okay, Mr. Chan in Hong Kong.
I think the demonstrations in different districts would cause a lot of trouble among people with opposite ideas. And some of the people believe that their goals are noble, so their goals justify their means, and so they can violently protest and disrupt the local business for their purposes. However, other people who suffer from this would oppose this. And recently, we already have seen some of these things that are very dangerous, and I don't want to see anything like that happen again.
All right, and Mr. Wang in Xi'an, closing remarks.
I think indeed, on the one hand, the law and order have been violated. It's very disappointing in that regard. On the other hand, the some of the protester people still have very legitimate demands. I think the SAR government need to address some of the very fundamental concerns of the people, some of the systemic structural problems of the Hong Kong society, in order to rebuild trust between the people and the government.
All right, no signs of abating of the situation there in Hong Kong. We'll keep watching. Wang Jiangyu of the National University of Singapore, Cheung Siu Wai from Hong Kong Baptist University, and Qinduo of the Pangoal Institution. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me on that point today.